Hi, everyone, and thanks for logging in. For those whom I haven't had the opportunity to meet at previous IPAC virtual events or in the distant but not forgotten days of actual in-person human interaction, my name is Brendan Campbell, and I'm a member of the IPAC Nova Scotia Board of Directors. And on behalf of IPAC Nova Scotia, I'd like to welcome everyone to our session on the future of remote work in government. For many of us, we're rounding a full year of working from home and have gotten used to the pros of working in sweatpants, as well as the cons of not being able to truly leave the office when the office is our home. Tonight, we are fortunate to have a great panel of speakers who can discuss the new normal of our virtual workplaces and what the future will look like in these uncertain times. Leading the discussion will be our moderator, Dr. Sara Filbee, former ADM for the Atlantic Region of Employment and Social Development Canada, and current public servant in residence at Dalhousie's School of Public Administration, Dr. James Barker, Lamb Chair of Business Education at Dalhousie's Rowe School of Business, and founding fellow at the MacEachen Institute of Public Policy and Governance. Throughout the discussion, please feel free to add any questions, and we'll try to get to them in the chat at the end. And with that, I'll throw it over to our moderators to introduce the rest of the panel.
Thanks very much, Brendan. I'm going to lead off. This session, it came from my experience and those of many others, of course, across governments and across many of the sectors during COVID. I'm co-moderating it with my colleague, Jim Barkhouse, Jim Barker. I live in Chester and there's so many Barkhouses here. It keeps confusing sometimes, but Jim Barker. And we're going to be featuring speakers from ESDC Service Canada as the lives lived experience. So we have Darlene de Gravina, ADM of HR, and Christine McDowell, the current ADM of Atlantic Region. And then we will also be hearing from Phil Clampitt, the University of Wisconsin, also known apparently as Dr. So What, talking about the research and what we've learned from the research. And then followed up by Matthew Kobylar, who is design director with Gensler, talking about the workplace of the future. So last winter, COVID hit. I was ADM of the Atlantic Region at the time. And at the time that it hit, telework in our department was almost a bad word. I don't know what the percentage was, but my guess is it was less than 10%. Almost overnight, we had to get to a place where we had about 85% plus that were working from home remotely. And it obviously, it is a fundamental change to how we work together. Now, obviously, there's a lot of technical challenges. There were procurement challenges, and I'm sure most everybody listening on the call will be aware of that. And while those are important, my research was actually in managing in complexity, and in particularly the role of trust in how we work together. So that led me to continually raise for my colleagues the challenges about the social relating and how we relate to each other and our relationships and so on, and how they might be affected by telework. So this is what we're going to explore this afternoon. My colleague Jim has for many years been working, looking at complex organizational behavior, ethics, sustainable processes, and focusing on leadership and change management and stakeholder engagement. So he is the perfect person to co-moderate this session with me. Over to you, Jim. Thanks. Oh, and one more thing. I do, in the COVID disclosure world, I have a kitten, and if it attacks me, there will be a bad look on my face. So it won't be anything that anybody said. Over to you, Jim.
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah. And I hope the cat finds a good, safe place to be while we're talking here. As Brendan mentioned at the outset, what COVID-19 has given us a new way of working, and now we have a year's worth of experience with that way of working. One of the things that we've already learned from that is that whenever we all get the vaccine and things go back to something else new, it's not going to be the same that it was. We'll have this, what people like to call a new normal, a new way of working. So no matter how we worked before, we're going to be working differently from now on. So now that we have a year in, what becomes very important for us is to start to understand what happened and what we did, how we adapted, and that will position us then to go forward into that new normal with whatever that's going to start to unfold for us. That's what we're starting to put together. And that's really the purpose of our panel today, is to work on articulating that new normal. So as Sara noted, we're going to start out with the experiences, with two senior officials who've had experience dealing with it, direct experience, and they're going to articulate that. Both Darlene and Christine will articulate their experiences that they had, how they adapted, and how they tried to move forward. Then we want to seek, what can we learn from that experience? That's where Phil's going to come in. Phil's going to help us process those experiences and help us see what we can learn from them, what we've already learned from them, and how we can then work to position ourselves to go forward. Now, as we go forward, much like we've done when we had to adapt, when Sara noted, we had to very quickly move to these work at home kinds of platforms and ways of working, we have to think innovatively. We have to think differently, but yet in a way that still works. That's where Matthew's going to come in. Matthew's going to help provoke how we think, help get us to think in somewhat new directions so that we can take those experiences, we can take what we've learned from them and be able to move forward effectively, positively, and healthily as we go. So with that, we're going to start with Darlene. Darlene, if you would, just talk to us about the experiences that you've had as you adapted to the pandemic and as you changed the ways that you worked in your office.
Thank you very much, Jim, and big hello to everybody in IPAC, Nova Scotia. I'm coming to you today from Ottawa, and I had actually just started as the ADM of Human Resources for Employment and Social Development Canada about 5 months before we found ourselves in the pandemic situation. So truly, my getting to know the department was sort of part and parcel of my getting to lead during a pandemic situation. I have some slides here today, but I will just really use them loosely to guide my comments. So essentially the second slide, and I'm not sure if folks are looking at that or if you've had a chance to see my presentation, but essentially we just thought we'd talk a little bit, or I would talk a little bit about not only our experience as a large federal department and how we were able to still serve Canadians during this pandemic, but also as a leader and as the head of HR, what were sort of the realities that I was faced with. So essentially, by way of context, the Employment and Social Development Canada is also the home of Service Canada, and that's what most Canadians are aware of in terms of that's our arm, which does a lot of sort of outreach and has presence in 320 odd Service Canada centers from coast to coast to coast, and we have a lot of various outreach and passport standalone offices as well. So we also have over 31,000 employees, again, across the country. Many of these employees find themselves in face-to-face situations with the public every day, and many more of these employees are actually in processing centers, working sort of behind the scenes, or working in call centers. All of these employees found themselves literally from one day to the next in this pandemic situation where we had to make some quick decisions and invoke our emergency management and business continuity processes last March. So initially we closed down the Service Canada centers, but we then did reopen them a few weeks later with some protocols in place to ensure the safety of our people. The standard personnel protective equipment, plexiglass, things like that. But many of our people, in the order of 85% of our 31,000 people, found themselves working at home almost from one day to the next. One of the first things we had to do, and it was almost Herculean, was to ensure that all of these people were offered mobile devices, either sort of text-only cell phones to be their new work phone, or laptops, so that they could start to link in through VPN pathways to do the work that they would normally do for Canadians, but from a new location. So this was a massive undertaking for us. There was all kinds of thinking as well in terms of making sure that the security of Canadians' information was still respected, to make sure that the employees had the connections that they needed to various databases, but also, and importantly, to make sure that managers were equipped to be able to manage at a distance. And this was completely new for the vast majority of our managers. So this was something that pretty much took all of our headspace over the months of, let's say, March through June. And really, I would categorize our sort of reaction to the pandemic in terms of adaptation, awareness, and adoption. So initially our posture was, okay, so how can we still serve Canadians? How can we still make sure that our critical programs are offered to Canadians? And much of that was, dealing with sort of the IT question, but also making sure that our employees were available to do their work. And this was not only Service Canada employees, but policy shops, which had to do things with CRA, like Invent the Serve, for instance. All of our enabling functions like finance and human resources and IT folks, all of these folks were now having to figure out how to do their work from home. In terms of awareness, it became clear to us very quickly that we were going to have to turn to the mental health questions that were cropping up in terms of our employees. So people were living either in fear of perhaps catching the virus. They were living with situations where they had family members, young children, aged parents close to them that they had to care for. So how could we make sure that people could, do the best work that they could and still, try and make good on these other commitments in their lives? And then ultimately, from an adoption perspective, our question has become, in this new world, what are the things that going forward we would like to adopt because they turned out to be better than how we had worked in the old world? So that sort of describes a little bit the logic and the way that our thinking progressed. One thing that's been fascinating for us as well is because of both the programs we manage and addressing sort of, inventories of cases that we might have been carrying, and also because of transformation reasons, we've been onboarding new employees, and we've taken on in the order of 5,000 new people this past year. And here we are hiring people who will have, in some cases, never set foot really in an ESDC office. So this again changes the game entirely in terms of how managers are equipped to onboard people. How do we transmit culture? How do we transmit ways of doing things to our new employees? And then, again, what is our sort of almost work contract with folks who were hired with the idea that, they might, for the duration of their employment with us, be working at a distance. When it comes to thinking about what happens next, I actually don't want to even consider what it could look like if we went back entirely to the way we used to work. We have surveyed our employees, and 90% of them are comfortable with their new work posture, and indeed over 2/3 of them would not want to return to the workplace with the rhythm that they used to show up at work. Again, the vast majority of our folks would either like to work full-time from home or would like to work in a mixed blended kind of model where perhaps 3 days a week they're at home, 2 days they're at work physically. So this will change how we configure our offices. This will change perhaps our real estate kind of posture going forward. But fundamentally, what people were finding was there were opportunities to better balance their work lives and their home lives. And indeed, we didn't, in our initial year, see any big drags in productivity. In some instances, we saw some light improvements in productivity. Now, some of our jobs are easier to measure than others in terms of productivity, but certainly folks weren't wanting to stay home because there was less work or that they had to do less work. In fact, if anything, folks are working harder, folks are working longer hours, and this is something that we've had to deal with and manage from a mental health perspective and from a, avoiding burnout kind of perspective. So again, we were pleasantly surprised at how resilient our workforce was, but we've put in place a lot of supports, including mental health supports, employee assistance program, to maintain the resilience of our workforce. And we have been looking at modernizing our hiring process as well and making sure that we are ready to onboard people into our more modern workplace. And this last slide here, as you can see, taking a look at some of the aspects, both at a personal level and at a leadership level, in terms of how we build the rhythm of our engagement with our staff, in terms of, how we continue to reach out to them and support them to get the best that we can from our staff. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Oh, you're very welcome, Darlene, and thank you for covering your experiences and talking about that. And there's an element that really struck me, Darlene, and we have a few minutes I would like to ask you about to comment on. But if you remember for the slide that Darlene spoke about that had the adapt, awareness, and adopt on it. And those represent a key process that all managers move through when they face these kinds of uncertain, complex situations. We try to figure out what it is that we do, go about doing something, and then if it works, we continue it. If it doesn't work, we do something else. And it sounds quite simple, but that is actually a key way that we deal with these kinds of complex environments. But there's a key part about that awareness piece, Darlene, that I want to ask you about. What struck me as you're talking about that is that you were talking about key conditions that you had to put in place, like the very last thing you talked about, ways to maintain resilience, how to hire and do onboarding in ways that you had never done it before. And perhaps one of the more mundane but vital elements there was how you get the technological resources in place that you need to make this work on very short order. Would you take that one? That one's actually the one that intrigues me the most because it is the most, what we wouldn't really think about doing, but yet it's so pivotal. Could you talk a bit about how you were able to get the kinds of resources, that key condition to make the adaptations work, how you were able to get those in place?
Thanks, Jim. It was certainly a miracle of procurement. And I think my colleagues, both in IT and in procurement, deserve medals for how quickly they were able to source and distribute these materials. In many cases, we had managers driving around to different parts of town with mobile equipment in their trunks, and they were knocking at doors, leaving the equipment on the porch to allow for sort of the social distancing. And we were this low tech in some cases in terms of getting things out to people. We had other places across the country where we had sort of stations set up at the workplace, and somebody could book a time when they would come in and pick up their equipment. So indeed, when one considers there were tens of thousands of these mobile equipment pieces found, purchased, and distributed, it was miraculous, and it was a game changer. So many of our folks really couldn't have contributed without this support. Thanks, Jim.
And we so often think of our public organizations as being so inflexible, so unable to adapt, and that's the general perception that we have. But one of the interesting things about the pandemic, it shows us that really doesn't hold up. Whenever those organizations need to do something and they need to do it quickly, we can find the way to do it. And that way is through, as Darlene was talking about, adapting, the awareness about those conditions and how they're working, and then how we adopt going forward. So I'd ask you out there to keep that process in mind and use it to reflect on your own experiences as you try to learn from your own experiences and as you work in changing your ways of working and adapting and adopting what you want to adopt in your work. Now let's continue with talking about the experiences as we move on to Christine. Christine at a slightly different place working with the ministry, but yet still a senior manager role and having to go through this same process. Christine, let's hear about your experience.
That's great. Thanks so much. And so pleased to be with you all this afternoon. I want to talk a little bit about what it was like before COVID, what happened, how we responded, and then highlight how it is working for us a year later. So from an operational perspective, which is where I sit as the ADM of the Atlantic, we're very much the operational arm of ESDC and Service Canada. Employees, work was a place they went. There was no, as Sarah mentioned earlier, there was no telework, no remote working. Occasionally folks would have to take a call from home, but certainly our operations were geared around the workplace, and workplaces were designed to do that. I want to talk a little bit about our footprint. So not only did we have offices to go to do our work, but some of the buildings, some of the offices that we had were designed for a specific purpose, whether that was our in-person client-facing activities, whether those were call centers, whether those were processing centers, very much designed around the type of activity that in fact happened there. But very, like others would probably know, a leader could stand up, look out over the field of cubicles and get a sense of what was happening with the work on any given day. Travel was extensive in terms of reaching out and connecting with one another. We spent a lot, certainly at a senior level, a lot of time traveling between locations, traveling back and forth to Ottawa for senior management meetings. Our staff spend a lot of time traveling to particular locations. And if there were quality monitoring to do, then we'd have consultants travel to work alongside those frontline workers. So travel was a significant part of budgetary expenditures. And then, of course, COVID happened. And so, I don't think, Darlene does not, she's not over describing it to say, it was a significant pivot. We changed our way of working, and in many, many cases, how we did things, and then also what we delivered really, really quickly. ESDC Service Canada was significantly implicated in the government's response to COVID. And we, while upskilling our employees with the kind of technology that they needed, we were also at the same time tasked with an enhanced mandate to get tools and finances and programs and services into the hands of Canadians right across the country. And so we quickly returned to remote work. That meant, for example, in our Service Canada centers, where the bulk of those interactions would have happened in person, we actually needed to stand up a new service delivery model, while many, many offices were shut down because we didn't have the personal protective equipment in place. We had to shut those offices down while still delivering services. So we stood up a digital channel within a couple of weeks, equipped our staff to be able to go in and respond to Canadians' needs within a service standard of 48 hours. So again, just not only what we did, but how we did it. Over the course of summer, we equipped those offices. We bought lots and lots and lots of plexiglass and masks and gloves and all of those sorts of things to make sure that our staff were safe, but that our clients were safe. We also had to balance then our in-person traffic and the digital traffic. That has continued to be a really interesting and expanding area of business for us as it relates to direct citizen services. And so it's changed the way that our employees work, what they do on a day-to-day basis, and how they interact with clients. From a technological perspective, Jim, I just wanted to cycle back. I mean, it was around procurement and it was around distribution, but again, it also was around the way that we work. So it was laptops, tablets, cell phones, our ability to connect via video, very much like we're doing today. Our cloud and collaborative tools, again, with space taken out of the equation, we still needed to find ways for people to come together, exchange ideas, develop product, and continue to work in collaboration. Bandwidth was also a significant challenge for us. And again, our IT folks just worked heroic efforts there to find solutions that I don't necessarily understand, but split tunneling to make sure that we have much more access now than we ever did. In our way of working, access to confidential documents, particularly with colleagues in headquarters, but here in the regions, we also are accessing confidential documents, and our systems are only geared for a certain level of privacy and protection. So finding solutions for that would continue to allow us to work and support the government of the day. Productivity goals. What was happening in an in-person environment, again, with on-site management in many cases, looking actively at productive stats, changes when you're working at a distance. And how do we measure productivity in this new environment? Do we use the same inputs and measures? So that was a little bit around what it was like and what happened. What it's like now, certainly, as Darlene has mentioned, culture shift. In the public service, folks who've worked in the public service will know, culture is hardwired back into the public service, and it's not easy to change. I think one of the things that preoccupies me is, in a remote environment where we have hired on a significant number of staff in this region in the Atlantic, by the end of March will be 1,500. Many of those folks have never come into an office except to pick up their IT kit and go home. All of their training's been online, their teams are remote. How do we transmit that culture about what it means to be a federal public servant? Which certainly throughout my career happened not necessarily by training, but just through participation in the workplace, and has been transmitted by colleagues and interactions with colleagues. For me, I see certainly even at this point new approaches to management emerging. Sarah references trust regularly. That to me is a critical piece. If we try to manage the inputs and not necessarily what people are achieving or responsible for in the outputs, it places us in a really difficult position. I think it's more important to set outcomes. I don't think we're there yet. Those conversations are still happening, but setting outcomes and then trusting people to achieve them and kind of measuring where we are in real time. Empathetic leadership is more important as we enter into a full year now of COVID response and managing in this environment. What was initially a crisis response is now much more sustained, and we're starting to see impacts of that. Despite folks, for the most part, enjoying working from home, it's the connection, it's the social interaction that they miss with their colleagues. And so we need to find ways of having those interactions and looking at perhaps our management model that was designed for an in-person management approach, and looking at that as in terms of maybe it's more managers, maybe it's managers with a different kind of skill, but it's definitely different management. The other thing that I will say is in terms of the way we work across regions. So my role today is in an operational environment here in the Atlantic region. And our headquarters folks typically set functional advice and guidance, work really closely, as many departments do, with the political system. And those lines had always been clearly established. I see now, even in at this stage, remote working starting to blur those lines. We've seen the need for a much shorter runway on the policy to service continuum. And we can think about the SERB benefits as a prime example of that. We've demonstrated that we can certainly do that kind of thing, and it was drawing the service delivery and the operational folks into the discussion from the outset. And I see that becoming much more important for us as Canadians' demands continue to rise. And then finally, Darlene touched on it on her. It's a shifting talent landscape where people are no longer tied to place. We can access talent in a number of different remote ways and have them connected to workplaces. So I'll stop there. I hope I didn't go over my time. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much, Christine. And there's something you said very early in your talk that really caught my attention, really was fascinating to me, and that was when you were talking about the before and now difference. And as you described before, as a senior leader, you could look over the field of cubicles, as you said, and get a sense, your own sense for how work was going, how productivity was. You could gain that by having that purview that you had. So Christine, if you could just for a moment, could you talk about how do you do that now when you don't have that luxury that you had before?
It's interesting. Thanks for the question. I would say our organization is data rich. We have a lot of data available to us. From a performance perspective, we get a really good sense of how long it takes to answer a telephone call, how many calls, how long a call takes to respond to, how long it takes to process a claim. I think we need to lean into, from a productivity perspective, in terms of how we actually use that data to tell the client story across all of those channels. How effectively is a client being treated, both from their public service interaction in our front ends, having perhaps their EI claim processed, having their questions answered, and then underlying all of that, how did they feel about it? Did they feel supported? Did they feel, even if necessarily they didn't get the answer that they wanted, did they have a good public service interaction? I think our challenge will be to use the data that we have to refine our notion of what productivity means and what our performance management approach should be. Rather than just looking at individual metrics. At the present time, that's what we have, but already conversations are starting to percolate around what does productivity mean in an environment where you can't necessarily see what everybody's doing at every moment of the day.
Well, what I want to do with what Christine was just talking about is to call the audience's attention to particularly what you were saying about productivity, where you're not just looking at metrics, you're looking at productivity more broadly and trying to understand productivity more broadly. And that becomes very key. Because if you remember Darlene talking about moving from adapting to awareness to adoption, to make that movement into adoption, we have to have the awareness of consequences, positive and negative consequences, and how we work with those. A key consequence of the work at home with COVID-19 experience has been the growth of surveillance technologies. There's a direct line between surveillance technologies and mental health, which is something Darlene also brought up and talked about. So that taking this positive and rather healthy view that Christine is talking about, with balancing what you have for the data with a more holistic sense of productivity, becomes very key for us. But Darlene, what struck me is that you talked about a number of different consequences that you had to work with, such as how you deal with confidential documents, how you transmit the culture, how you connect with employees that haven't, that just haven't met with each other, and how they work with each other. And that became very, that really stood out for me as you were talking. Could you just talk for just another moment about, in particular, how you tried to find the right way among these consequences that you had? How did you work out what was right to do?
Well, thanks very much. I don't know, I'm trusting the question was for me, but I'll talk a little bit and then Christine can jump in too. Yeah, we were always listening for feedback from our managers and feedback from our staff. We, as Christine mentioned, we're quite data rich, and we do what are called pulse surveys, which often involve, say, 10 to 20 questions. And we'll do these with a frequency of every 2 to 3 months to get a better sense of how our employees are living things. So we've done one on mental health, we've done one on working from home. So that's been a big source of information for us to see how things are going and how people are living things. But of course, we do all we can to support managers and to make sure they are equipped to understand how it is one manages human beings at a distance, and to listen to them as well. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, Christine, if you could take the same question. How did you find what was right to go forward, and especially in light of the consequences you were talking about? Yeah,
absolutely. Thanks, Jim. I think we're still finding it. I think initially it was trial and error, and but recognizing, as you mentioned, with the awareness that certainly we needed to be paying attention. Our staff were, quite forthcoming with great suggestions on how we could leverage technology to connect with them. Individual managers have taken different kinds of approaches to manage amount of meetings, but also interactions with staff. So, things that we'd all be familiar with now, the virtual coffee break, celebrations over Zoom, but also being very deliberate, I think, from a leadership perspective about how we use that time to engage with our staff, finding ways to engage with them meaningfully and hear back from them, in addition to the great surveys that Darlene mentioned. So we've leveraged the technology to hold town halls on specific subjects, hear back from them, their responses. Within individual business lines, they're taking very similar kinds of approaches, which I think is wonderful. All that to say, it requires deliberate, intentional effort on the part of manager and leadership, and a different kind of skill in this environment than they may have been accustomed to exercising before. And in some cases, it might be a skill that they don't necessarily even have. And so we're turning our attention to look at, from a training perspective, from a developmental perspective, what are the things that we need to do to equip our leaders and our team leaders to make sure that they, in fact, have what they need so that employees can feel supported.
Well, and thank you both very much, Christine and Darlene. And it's what becomes key here is to listen to how both Christine and Darlene worked through those consequences, how they tried to identify what's the right way to go forward. Now, a key way that we do that is trying to assess what can we learn, what worked, what didn't work. And again, a year into the pandemic now, we are starting to learn things, and that's going to take us into Phil. Phil is going to help us understand and help us process, particularly with the experiences that Christine and Darlene have given us, help us to understand what can we learn and how we can start to apply that learning. Phil?
Yeah, welcome everybody. It's great to be with you. I will tell you why I'm wearing this cap, because it's a COVID story. The night before, the night that we were told at the university here that we're going to have to shut down and you have one more face-to-face class, I woke up in the middle of the night with an epiphany and said, caps on, carry on, adjust, and perform. And so I kept the cap on ever since. And whenever I do these types of events, I always keep it on and tell that story, because I think that you have to carry on and adjust and perform, and all our students continue to do that. Of course, last night before this presentation, I had a dream about Sarah's cat attacking me. So I don't know where I'm going to do with that. But what I tried to do is in the handout that's available to everybody, is to summarize 10 observations from all the research that I could find, and realize this is all tentative research. It's the beginning of it. And so some of those conclusions will change. And so I thought I'd do today is just go through those 10 insights that we've seen kind of as collective ideas about research. And as Sarah mentioned, they call me Dr. So What at the university, because I'm always asking, so what? And I try to demonstrate clear thinking, which is let's think about the upside and the downside of these various trends, which is what the document is about. So let me just walk through some of those insights and try to tie it in with what we've already heard. The first research insight that came out was that, in fact, we've already had this echoed in the first two speakers. Darlene and Christine have talked about this. We're not going back. And that is the first insight is that anywhere from 20 to 25% of the workforce can efficiently and effectively work from the home 3 to 5 days a week. That's according to a McKinsey study. Now, that doesn't mean every task can be done at home. And moreover, it doesn't mean just because it's convenient to do it at home, that should be a task that should be done at home. And I think that will be a part of the negotiation that goes forward, is how do you figure out which tasks can be moved online and can be moved into remote workplace and what cannot. The other part of that, the other so what that I come out of that is that one of the things that as leaders we all have to do is to figure out how do you define the boundaries, the temporal boundaries, the physical boundaries, and the psychological boundaries that emerge from this remote work environment. And creating those is a really important part that used to be served functionally by coming to the office. You would be able to separate yourself, et cetera. So some of the psychological concerns that we see echoed not only in our first two speakers, but also in the research as well, about loneliness, feelings of isolation by some people, are partly about renegotiating those boundaries in a way. I suspect it's also related to what Jim and I have had quite a few conversations about, is the surveillance technology and the impact that it's going to have on that. So that's insight number one. I assume you can hear me all right, right? We're all good? Okay. Number two, and I don't have a cat on my head, Sarah. Not yet. But number two, the executives surveyed believe that office space, that the need for office space will decrease by 30%. I don't want to step on our next speaker's topic because it's really kind of interesting. That's what the executives say. They may or may not be correct. My suspicion is that it's going to be reconfigured office space to do certain things. And my so what is right now in the United States, 3% of current office space is flexible. The expectation is that will move to 25% as we see teams moving in and out of office spaces that are dedicated to a particular department or organization of some sort. So I think that's kind of up in the air, but I think you're going to see a much different kind of orientation in that regard. The third insight is one we've alluded to already, and I think it's probably the part that needs the most study, and that is some tasks are more suited to at-home work or remote work than others. Information updating, for example, can be handled remotely, but selling and influencing, managing certain kinds of conflict have to be done in other mediums at the very least, or they have to be flexibility within the remote medium. Give you one quick story. I have a faculty member that has conflicts from time to time in a remote environment, and a lot of it is done asynchronously. And my first prescription to him, interestingly enough, is call that student for a one-on-one discussion. And amazingly, a lot of things go away. But apparently, that's a very hard thing for him to do because he doesn't do it all the time. So having that flexibility as a manager and a leader to shift modes, even electronically, is a really important skill and feature to be able to realize that some things cannot be handled asynchronously and some things have to be handled that way. So I think that's a really important thing. I have my own personal test. When I work with executives, I say if I need a whiteboard, I want to be there mask to mask if I have to be, or face to face if at all possible. So if I need a whiteboard so we can doodle or we can spontaneously go back and forth like with a pencil and stuff like that, then I want to, if you want to call them pencil situations where you have an eraser, those are the types of situations where I want to have maximum interaction. And this kind of format that we're in right now is pretty difficult to do. And this is basically what I think it boils down to in terms of this particular idea. And you'll see it throughout everything that I talk about, is really the power of proximity. And that is, we've changed the nature of proximity. It's psychological, it's electronic, but the power of physical proximity is something we're discovering the limits of, as well as the positives of physical proximity. Which leads me to my fourth observation that came very clearly. And it's interesting that, I think we've talked about the fact that many people are now being onboarded. I didn't write down the exact number of the people that are being hired without ever meeting them face to face. But working remotely is a learned skill, and not everybody is learning at the same rate. So we may have to develop best practices for remote learning. In fact, I just interviewed a candidate today for a job, and I talked about that. I said, what is it? How do you arrange your environment to work remotely to maximize your effectiveness? And that was a question I asked as part of the interview process. And I'm going to ask all the candidates that question. Number 5 observation goes back to something that I kind of alluded to before, is that different tasks are associated with effective remote environment and others are not. And that is that established teams that have worked together several times, tend to work better in a remote environment. They are just as effective and develop, and sometimes even more efficient, as we've already noted, as Darlene noted. And but new teams have a real difficult time syncing up and getting on board with each other culturally and getting that vibe to work together well. And so after reading that and then kind of having experienced that, reading that in the literature and experiencing that, I'm going to, in my workplace, I'm going to insist that our first meetings of the year are always face-to-face or mask-to-mask, as the case may be. And then if we want to go remote, we can. But particularly when we have new employees, I want to see them. I want them to develop that so they can develop that kind of ability. And so I think managers are going to have to start adroitly managing that kind of dynamic of what types of events do we have face-to-face and what types of events do we have remotely. And there's going to have to be probably a clear separation and a signal within every group, work group, et cetera, that says, hey, this is one we're going to do in this environment. This is one we're going to do in that environment. And it signals a group of expectations. So that's the fifth piece of research that came out. The sixth one is more of something I gleaned from the literature than was actually directly stated, and that the emergent norms of a group, which everybody in this panel is very, very sensitive to given their positions, the emergent norms of a group are going to be far more difficult to sense, I think, in this remote environment. So you could have situations like faux engagement or faux participation. And we can kind of sense that, or at least I feel more comfortable about it, and I suspect many of our panelists do, when you're face-to-face. But you can't sense that quite as well. You talk to anybody who has their kids at home, studying and learning, they can point out any number of different examples where it's a game I'm playing with the teacher to create a faux engagement. So I think you're going to have to figure that out, and we're going to have to develop tools to assess faux engagement and faux participation. And then the seventh observation is one that we've talked about before, is that certain people management issues in particular are very poorly suited to onboarding. Now that may change as we get better and they get more tools, et cetera, but things like onboarding, sharing the culture, I think complex decision-making is something that I want to be there with people on the whiteboard, et cetera. So I think what that suggests from the so what standpoint is to train people on the proper use of various communication tools. And you can't have, I interviewed a manager years ago who they used to call stealth because he thought they called him the stealth manager. I said, why do you call him stealth? They said, well, because we never see him. He thinks he can manage this entire department through email. And that's what he did. He was a terrible manager, but that's the way he did it. And so my suspicion is those types of things will occur also if we don't deal with certain kinds of remote environment. Now, some tasks, maybe not, but some other high-level positions, it's going to be a challenge. Number 8 is something you probably all notice, is that remote meetings remotely conduct meetings tend to be shorter, but more frequent. In some ways, they're more efficient. So that will cause us to reevaluate the way in which we use meetings and meeting agenda. But the flip side of that is that I always get worried about is, again, the power of proximity, is tangential discussions and informal communication sometimes are great. They're sometimes really important, and you may discover a light bulb idea that is really important. Which leads me to number 9, observation number 9 from the data, which was that serendipitous connections drop off significantly with remote work, and even showing up 1 to 2 days can increase the improvement of serendipitous connections by 25%. And every one of us on this panel can think of that one time when we just happen to run into somebody and say, I'm working on this, and they say, well, you need to talk to so-and-so, or this is what you need to think about. And that moment that just was random almost, by being there in physical proximity, was worth hours and hours of research. So I think we're going to have to, as managers and leaders, is to praise the value of the unpredictable and praise the value of serendipitous connections, and establish norms that mix the expectations of what you can expect in a remote environment, as well as what you can expect in the serendipitous. And then final point that I would make is that something we've heard already, but the research on this is pretty clear. In fact, one of the statistics is rather astonishing to me, that work flexibility offered from remote is considered a perk by many employees, that if they can work from home. It used to not be, but now it's considered a perk. And in fact, the statistic that sort of astounded me that I found was that in some of the research is that 54% of office workers say they'd leave a job for more of this kind of flexibility. That's a sizable portion. And so we're going to have to, as we design jobs and design tasks, make sure there's a remote component for at least certain employees that desire it. There's a flip side to that, though. And I found that interesting. I talked to an executive literally last week. I was talking about remote work and talking about this panel and what we're going to be dealing with. And it was a whiteboard meeting because I wanted to work on the whiteboard with the executive because we were working on a complex strategy thing. But he said, you know, to me, I had a bunch of employees, their accountants had said, we want to stay remote afterwards. And he said, okay. We could do that, but he said, but you also got to realize that we pay premium dollars in this particular location, and we can hire people to do this task at a much less price at another location. And you already see this happening in Silicon Valley, where they're paying different prices, different dollar amounts, salary amounts, depending upon where the employee is located. So there's that dynamic as well to negotiate. So there's a lot of things up in the air. You know, one of my specialties is managing uncertainty. This is a rich environment for studying uncertainty. And so there's a lot of cool stuff that's going to happen. And so this is tentatively where we're at. And those are 10 things that emerge from I got folders like this thick of all the research that's been done, but they boil down, in my view, to those 10. And a lot of it's pretty thin at this point. So these things will be emergent and they'll change, but there are issues that all of us in this room need to start thinking about.
And I appreciate you bringing up those issues and us being able to think about them, Phil. One of the things that struck me, particularly as you were talking about the learned skill of working remotely, one of the first elements I learned is that as a manager, you have to be able to monitor both the video windows and the chat windows, because all the informal communications going on in the chat, and if you miss something in the chat, you lose so much of the context. You have to keep an eye on both. Phil, there's one thing I want to, if you could comment on very quickly, and it's a bit too early for these kinds of consequences to emerge yet because we haven't been through enough performance evaluation cycles. But where do you see performance management going? What's your feeling about where this is going to go?
Well, can I just make a comment on your other comment first about the side comment? Because, you know, Jim and I know each other so well, we can like finish each other's thoughts sometimes. So, and I've never met you face to face, so it clearly works. So, but I want to someday. I want to come up and see all the moose in Canada and all that stuff. So, you got better moose than we do. I know that. So, but there's not only monitoring the meeting. You know, we used to say you have to be an effective manager, you have to manage the meeting after the meeting, right? But now there's the meeting during the meeting, which is going on the side over here, where people are exchanging it. And then there's another conversation that could be going on by somebody texting while they're going on as well. So this is what I mean by that. That's the faux engagement. That's the faux, yeah, I'll say the right thing in a meeting, etc., and I'm going to do it. So to go back to your main question. So, I mean, the levels of this are amazing if you start thinking about the levels of the engagement. But to go back to your big question about how we're going to manage tasks, I think we're going to have to go, I think Christine mentioned this and Darlene mentioned this as well, is you're going to have to say, these are the kinds of outcomes I'm looking for, and you're going to have to go very task-oriented or project-oriented types of outcomes for certain things. The problem is some tasks are by definition not easy to define, and they're complex issues, and the way you might originally define the task might be different later. There are some parts that are, I don't know, for want of a better word, routine. There are others that are non-routine. those are the ones that I get worried about in the remote environment. I don't get worried about the routine tasks that are relatively straightforward, but I get worried about the non-routine, unusual, and managers getting blindsided. And that's where I think the 1 to 2 days a week that you're going to have to be in the office and the big picture. I think one of the so whats I wrote on here is that you want to start scheduling a tempo in your organization of face-to-face meetings so that people know that there's a tempo of things that we're going to do. We're going to meet face-to-face, because I think that's the critical to creating the right balance. What that tempo is, I don't know, but that's where I think we end up going.
Well, as we take from, and Phil, and thank you, Phil, and as we take from Phil and what you're talking about, I want to go back to a comment that you made, or the term really that you used, the power of proximity. And with the power of proximity, and we see that being disrupted so much in what we've experienced with the pandemic, but that is one of the key areas that we have to think very innovatively about. And we have to really think through, what are the architectures of our proximities going to be? If we're balancing in-office work with remote work, there's a new architecture there. What will that be? How can we think creatively, innovatively about that? And that's what Matthew's going to help us do right now. So now we're going to move into the part about how do we move forward? How do we think differently? How do we try to take these discussions that we've had about experiences, consequences, and what we've learned from it, and try to do something better with it? And that's what we're going to turn to Matthew for. Now, Matthew, please.
Great. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm coming to you from Toronto. I work for a practice called Gensler. We are a global interior design and workplace strategy firm. And we have offices across 50 cities, all the way from China, Australia, Japan, and several throughout the North America and Europe. My role is a design director, and my firm, I'm helping the firm establish kind of what this future work could mean. We've been working with clients that were working on projects before the pandemic shut them down. They sort of went on hold, and we've been starting to work with them about what this future could mean. So I'm going to share with you some of what that thinking is, and I'm really glad to be going after Phil, because he set the stage for so much research, and a lot of it really iterates with what we're hearing and how we're working on developing spaces for our clients. There's some things that the workplace really does better, and Phil mentioned this kind of power of physical proximity and this idea of serendipity occurring in the office. And so I'm scared, because as an interior designer, when he says that there's going to be a 30% decrease in office space, but I do believe that we will have a decrease in office space, and that people are going to use that space differently. It will be less about individual working spaces and more about building that collaborative and community hubs. So I'm going to share that with you through here. So to my point here, really the office, we feel, is going to matter. It's going to be a place about bringing the culture together. Christine talked about that, being worried about people joining the organization and having never stepped foot in the office. What are the cues that they pick up on what does it mean to be actually a public servant? One of the things that we're seeing is there'll be a new idea of choice, and an autonomy will emerge, and that will be people that will work 5 days a week. There'll be some people who work maybe 2 days a week. There could be a person who just decides during the summer they're going to only work 2 days a week from the office. And going forward, there may be some people that never show up to the office. They're actually so remote that they only come for the Christmas party. But this is going to be a kind of new kind of way of working. As Phil said, I wrote down, the genie is out of the bottle. Like, we've all gone home. We've all worked from home. There's nobody, and we did have a lot of clients before the pandemic that used to say, "Oh, our staff can't work from home." That's not a possibility for our people. They have to definitely work in the office. The proof is out. It actually works, and there's actually been some pretty significant productivity gains for a lot of people. So this, we see, will keep on going. And I think Phil touched on this idea that talent doesn't necessarily need to be within the 100 miles of your office. I mean, it can be further. You could actually have people in 1 or 2 time zones away, perhaps even as far as 3 or 4. Meetings can occur asynchronously. This meeting could be recorded, and somebody could see it 12 hours later and still get all of the content and information out of the meeting. people will be able to work from anywhere. And so organizations are starting to think about how is that journey, how is the entire experience of working for this organization? How is it actually supported when they're in the home, when they're commuting to work? And how is the office space, or perhaps a series of office spaces where you maybe have a whole hub and spoke model, are all places that people can drop in to actually network, socialize, learn, and do those things that the office is appearing to do better than the home is appearing to do. We are definitely seeing a new cadence for the office. It's no longer kind of a work from 9 to 5. We're seeing that this cadence is definitely changing, and that some of it is perhaps going to be driven in the future by season. As we've seen, there's been rises of COVID in the winter, and that was always also the case with flu. But there may be some things like this where we start to see a seasonal cadence of when people shift to work from home and when do they shift to work from the office. It may also be supported by functional teams, that some teams are going into the office and working from the office at certain times, and then a second shift comes in and works to maybe finish up sort of in a model of agile development. And then this kind of idea that you choose the kind of work mode that you're doing for the day, whether you're doing focused work, you may say, well, actually the best place for me to do this focused work is from home today, and so I'm going to choose that. But when I need to be in a more of a collaborative environment, I'm actually choosing to go to the office. And I think this is creating a new cadence. It's something that's very different from the kind of 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 that many people had. I've heard this kind of expression that work from home, it's not really work from home, it's work is home. And that our models have really extended from working from maybe 8 to 8 and 9, and knowing when to shut off becomes extremely important. So what we're seeing is that this idea of a connected experience, the workplace of the future, is really this kind of thing where people, place, and technology all meet through this idea of a connected experience in the middle. And you start to see these things around the connection point between people and place, where the culture, that purpose of the organization, really is what's being celebrated there or being brought to bear. And when we look at place and technology, we start looking at data and how can data actually help us understand how people are using a space? What's the utilization rate? We used to measure kind of productivity or office effectiveness, efficiency in square foot per person. We're now starting to see a trend where we start to measure that by percentage occupancy. And then this other place is in between people and technology is the idea of the user experience. How is technology and people coming together to actually create a great user experience within this new connected experience? So just to show you a kind of example of what we're sort of seeing, this is a status quo sort of pre-pandemic workplace. What you can see here is a large portion of the space is dedicated to concentration spaces. These might be open plan workstations. We're in a 1-to-1 desk per person ratio. So every person that works for the organization has a desk that's assigned to them. And you can see large areas of those workstations and bit of areas for co-creation, bit of areas for connection, and some areas for inspiration. When we start thinking about how this might shift in a new place, a new workplace that's actually designed to leverage the work from home experience, we start seeing a couple things shift for sure. One is that the number of desks is one desk for every 3 people. We start to leverage that ability of people to work from home, and sometimes they're working in the office. And as you can see here, the number of spaces for concentrated work, those kind of desks, really shrinks quite a bit, because really the workplace is excelling when people are using it for connection, for co-creating, and in being inspired. And so the workplace has all of those other spaces, and then a few places for you to drop in and do some focused, concentrative work. If you're there for the day and you're really spending the time to connect with your colleagues, you're working on, as Phil says with his rule that if I need a whiteboard, we all have to be together. Well, you're probably not working with Phil all 8 hours of that day. You might need a bit of time to actually go off and do some other work. And that's what those spaces become useful for. So you probably all maybe know this saying as a young architect studying architecture, form follows function. That's Louis Sullivan's big quote. And we're sort of saying that maybe needs to change in the new model, but it's about form follows the purpose. And what are you trying to achieve? So I'm going to share with you a few different ideas and space models of what might be in the future for us as we start to think about how we use workplace in this new model where perhaps as much as 30 or 50% of your people are able to work from home on a day-to-day basis. How do we design new offices for them? one of the things is that we're looking at is open workspaces that are highly flexible. They're highly what we call hackable. That is that they can be changed by the end users. You can see in this diagram here, there's lots of walls and partitions that can be moved. Every wall is able to be pinned up with stuff. Some of them are digital walls, so that's whatever you're writing there can also be shared with anybody on a laptop. And this whole entire space is really movable. So teams can instantly come together, whether for a day or a week or longer, and then disperse, and the space can be returned to kind of the group, and other people can come in and use it in different ways. We're seeing an idea of actually creating a home office digital twin. So this idea that within your laptop will actually have spaces there that will be mirroring what's actually in different spaces and workrooms and offices. So say you may have actually a map on your laptop that is a lap of your office. And when your colleagues say, oh, we're all going to meet in, I don't know, the Cedar Vale room, everybody pops into that Cedar Vale room and you click on the Cedar Vale map on your laptop and you are joined instantly through the technology into that room. And we're really seeing this idea of bringing this hybrid meeting equity so that people that are joining this meeting from home are getting the same exact experience as people that are actually in the meeting themselves. We're seeing creation of these kind of neighborhood hubs within the workplace. So the physical office would have this kind of live digital wall that tells you where everybody is. It gets into some issues, as Phil was starting to talk about, this idea of surveillance. Can it be that actually I can be tracked when I'm in the office so that other people can find me because nobody has an assigned seat anymore? How will they click in and know where I'm at? And so this does tap into some ideas about surveillance, how much surveillance would be allowed, and would it actually tell people where you are working, whether you're at home, whether you're in the office, where you're at, and helps the teams to connect and find people. We're seeing the kitchens really expand, and so rather than places to just grab and go and get a cup of coffee and then get back to your desks, these are really expanded into these network social areas and places. And we're also seeing that idea of tracking your movements. It's like when I decide to go to a coffee, my team members might be alerted if they're working from home or they're even in the office. They might be alerted that says, oh, actually, teammate Matt, it might pop up on their phone, and Matthew's gone to the kitchen. And there I could connect with them on a virtual screen that's actually repeating the actual view that's in the kitchen there. And so we can have those kind of conversations pop up. And so technology is really helping to connect people, but then the spaces are created that are larger and assisted with technology to help make those connections. And it's all about bringing that equity and parity to those that are hybrid working from home versus hybrid working from the office. Conference rooms we see are going to shift to be much more flexible. There'll be a wide range of furniture settings first off. So the furniture becomes quite hackable, movable to be any sort of situation, any sort of instant meeting, instant collaboration, instant brainstorm. And then all the walls here are either digital in some capacity. So they're either immersive digital walls where whatever you're writing is actually shareable and it's created into a giant mirror board that everybody can share on their laptops at home. And then you can see here that somebody, as you see here, this woman in green, she's not actually a green person. That's the digital twin of somebody who's actually there. They're able to see everything that's happening and having that same experience by using the digital office. And then the people in the office are also aware of that digital twin's presence in the office. These collaboration nooks here would abound the space. And these are kind of like always on, always live, always capturing information and data so that you can drop in. You don't have to sign into, you don't have to set up the meeting. The meeting is always live and on. You can see here digital walls that would be posted up. People can post things up there and it's all shared. You can drop your content from, if you're working remotely, onto that same digital wall and your colleagues can see it. You pop over to here and you're on camera. It's a way of actually still working together, even though we may be working alone. It's a way of saying, oh, you have that moment of spontaneous conversation that suddenly goes, I'm wondering how I should do this problem. And then somebody says, oh, you know what, you should do it this way. This is a better way, or think about that. We lose that kind of activity when we're all working from home. So these kind of spaces help to create those opportunities for teams to still work together. And this is maybe even out there a little bit is the idea of broadcast fitness studios. So as group movement and wellness becomes increasingly important, how can folks that are working from home actually still be part of that meeting and be part of that experience? So this is tying into that user experience using technology to give people that are at home, perhaps they're on a treadmill or they're on a bicycle, as in this case, or maybe they're even just doing home Pilates with the class, but they're still taking part in having that cultural connection back with their colleagues. And then lastly here, this idea of an experience center. This is kind of a ultra tech immersive space. You can see, again, digital twins are here. So there's a twinned environment here, but this is a place you can bring clients into. It's really sort of the Minority Report gone bad, gone like on steroids, and everything is connected here. So again, this space, perfectly designed with hackable furniture, allows for flexible seating and flexible arrangement of space and real-time data visualizations. So I think this last slide here talks about the workplace as an 18th century salon. And this is sort of my thinking about the workplace of the future is it kind of goes back to the past in some ways. It becomes a place where you may work alone, off in your home, and then you're coming back to the office because it's offering you something else. It's offering you this chance to connect with colleagues, share information, learn something, really the way that an 18th century salon did. I think this picture just, the change that we would see now is that all these people would have laptops and other digital devices with them. And that's very much a way I see that the office is going to be in the future. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew. And what really struck me as we think back through the disruptions and the ways of adapting through those disruptions that Christine and Darlene talked about, through to Phil, particularly highlighting Phil's notion about the power of proximity and our need for proximity. Now we go into Matthew and your discussions of how we can take that power of proximity and leverage it for these new ways of working, this new normal of working, where we have to have these highly collaborative, connective kinds of environments there. And the other part, Matthew, that really struck me with this, and it was a slide about a third of the way through or so, that you were talking about the new workplace and the forming of the new workplace with these places for connection, collaboration, co-creation, and inspiration to happen. And our studies of complexity teach us that those three elements are really vital for us as human beings in organizations to deal with complex environments, to deal with fluid and dynamic environments. So we really need those places. But one thing I'd like for you to comment on, Matthew, just briefly, and I will go back to something that Christine mentioned, and that was the way that we used to work. How, as the manager, as the leader, you could go out and have the survey, the purview of all the cubicles, and you could get a sense for what's going on. That's how we tend to teach people. And I would wager we're still teaching people from that kind of method. How, or what advice do you have for us, Matthew, as how to take Phil's notion of this being a learned skill? How can we as managers, as leaders, how can we learn how to make these new kinds of environments work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, we're in such a state of change. I don't think that everyone's exactly aware or knows what the future is going to be. So a lot of the folks that we're working with are kind of, either kind of dealing with a situation where they're saying we're in this state now, and then there's a future state. And I'm not sure the jury's out on just how much people are going to be. I think the genie's out of the bottle, and we say that we have to work from home, or we say we're going to allow work from home. But there's a number of organizations that have been, putting a flag in there and saying, actually, we want people to come back to the office as quickly as possible, because this just isn't really going to work for us long term. Mm-hmm. And it is to those issues of how do you mentor people, how do you train those people, and it is that shift from presenteeism to maybe measuring performance by productivity. I'm not sure I have like the best advice for how to manage teams. I know what I do with my teams is a lot of check-ins, and then I have to work from like 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock at night to actually do any of the work that I'm supposed to do, because I'm spending all my time in meetings all day just checking in with people. It is difficult because I think in the past you used to be able to go out there and kind of feel the buzz, feel the rank. And we've actually had some clients who are doing audits because their managers want to figure out what's happening with those projects, and they're asking us, they're actually having like internal audits to get a better sense of how their troops are feeling about their movement to new workplaces.
Well, that's really an interesting comment that you put, because what occurred to me as you were talking there, Matthew, is how much of my time that I spend checking in on the various and different projects that I supervise, that I oversee. But I spend a lot of time checking in with the people who have the particular responsibility for moving those forward, with me having the responsibility for them all going forward. But that part about checking in, staying in touch, staying connected really struck me as you were talking about it there. Now, what we've done in our presentation today, we've talked about how we have adapted, become aware of the consequences of that adaptation, and then adopted to keep moving forward in what's becoming this new way that we're working in the public service area. We also talked about what we've learned from that and how we can take that learning and start to rethink, reimagine, and envision new ways of what that new normal is going to be as we go forward. We've got some time for questions now. And Sarah, I'd like to come back to you right now. And Sarah's going to work with us as we take on a few questions from the audience. Sarah?
Sorry, I thought I had myself unmuted, but I had not. So thanks very much. A fabulous discussion. And, one of the things at ESDC was because of our countrywide footprint and significant countrywide footprint, we'd already had a significant amount of experience in virtual working. But this is, obviously taking virtual working from the point of view of not everybody being in the same headquarters. And so having to have meetings with senior management in different regions and so on and so forth. So we do have some questions. Let me think. I think one of the questions I thought quite interesting came from Julia Spence, and really looking at the concerns that have been expressed about social interaction and collaboration, and whether that will change with the generations. Her view being that many millennials and Gen Xers are already very used to creating community online. So do we have a bit of a different approach according to generations? Darlene.
Thanks. And thanks for the question, Julia. Indeed, that has occurred to some of us at ESDC, that some of us older dinosaur types who perhaps weren't as accustomed to creating community in a virtual space have something to learn from our younger colleagues. Indeed, where I am right now, I have several of our younger colleagues who've put together like a social committee and who are very adeptly making sure that we have engagement opportunities for all staff, who are comfortable doing sort of vibe checks online. So I think that we're going to see, this might be a short-term kind of pain point for us, but over time, absolutely, I think that the workplace will prove to have changed. And this was a big inflection point for us, because there is a whole generation of people who are coming into the workplace now who don't necessarily need to be face-to-face with people to build that community. Thanks.
Any other thoughts from amongst the panelists?
I'll jump in on that one, because I just think that we've had this discussion about Gen X and Gen Y, and one of the things I study is that issue. Clearly, when I think the certain generations are going to be much more attuned to managing it, but they are also a danger of thinking that technology can solve all these problems of collaboration, and I don't think they can. That's one element. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Number one, there are cues that are just missing in an online environment. I mean, I've got a relatively good working relationship with like Jim, for example, but I never met him face to face. And so that clearly can work, and you can build a community that way. But there are things missing I don't know about Jim that might be useful. The second piece of it is workplaces involve people of multi-generations, and some generations are more comfortable with technology and others are not. And so bridging that gap may be more difficult than bridging it within a particular generation. And so that's where the community building and culture building becomes really important, because the people who have the most experience with the culture oftentimes are of a different generation than the newer generation. And it's nothing wrong with building a new culture, but there's something that needs to be transmitted that certain generations are going to find it very difficult to communicate and deal with. And plus, I want Matthew to keep his job. I mean, I want Matthew to build all kinds of cool buildings. So I think there's great kinds of,
I appreciate that, Phil. Thank you.
Well, I felt bad last time we were saying that, office space is going down, but I want, I think collaboration, getting together in that environment is very cool. So I don't discount what that question. It's an excellent question, but I think you have to be cautious about it because technology can only take us so far.
I'm going to move on to another question, which I also thought was excellent. And I guess my comments as I was opening this section up relate to it. Hargan C. talked about looking at the culture and how does the mindset on remote work change once not everybody is on remote. It didn't come up today. He's asking how we factor this in, but it didn't come up today, but career progression. What does the FaceTime, the new FaceTime look like? Is there an advantage to FaceTime? I have seen where you have just very few people in the room with the deputies, that their relationships with the deputies become very, very strong. Not talking inappropriate or anything like that, but you can see that the trust between them is significant. Going back to the old world where at ESDC, there was just a few of us out in what I call windmill land. And I call it windmill land because you have to do this to get anybody's attention to make any type of an intervention. Clearly that's changed and will change as we get more comfortable with having more people. But again, it does show the disconnect between having just a few people remote or just a few people in the office. And there is a big differential. Any reactions to that from the panelists?
Yeah, I think my own experience is very similar to yours. We have an office in Toronto, and our Montreal office calls into that on every Monday morning. And they always were just on the Hollywood Squares. And then we were all in the room there talking together, and they struggled to get our attention sometimes and feel like they were having the same kind of interaction that we were all having while we were in the same room. And they've told me like, oh, it's so great now because we're all equal. We all have this same equal moment. I think that one of the things you mentioned there, Sarah, is going to definitely be true, that in the, if some people are coming back to the office and they seem to be getting more time with the boss, more time with their associates, and actually they're getting to work on maybe the choice projects, they're getting what seems to be promotions and advancement because of that physical presence, that power of the physical proximity that Phil mentioned. I think you're going to start to see maybe that starts to bring more people back into the office that are in that kind of competitiveness for getting further in their career, if that's one of the things that's motivating them.
Phil?
Sarah, I'm going to have to run. I have one of those mass-to-mass class I've got to teach right now. But I just wanted to say one thing to throw into this discussion before I leave, and that is the reason why I'm a little reluctant to say technology can solve all these problems is it's one of the things I crave, getting back to the old world, is live theater. And so one way to look at this is that I've watched enough television at some point. I want to go to a live theater and be in a community where I have a group of people that I know have roughly the same values. I donate to the local theater group, etc. And there's something about that live performance and spontaneity of that, and the interactiveness and intimacy of that's so different than experiencing it, even though there's interaction that you can have. And so I just would be cautious about that. And then one final thought, and then I've got to run. I don't mean to run, but I told you I was going to have to. I think one of the keys to this is that we can't do what we used to do, but we can learn from a lot about how we use our time in the workplace. And I wrote down, as Matthew was talking and Darlene was talking, there's kind of thinking time, collaborating time, exploring time, working time, and inspiring time. And as you start to think about these different types of times, some of them can be done virtually, but some of them are maximized in a face-to-face or mass-to-mass environment, which is what I'm going to have to do right now. So I'm going to bid adieu. I've enjoyed chatting with you. I'd love to do it again, with or without caps, but always with a cap on until we can get rid of these things. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Phil. And I'll very quickly go to Darlene because she has, and then I think we have to wrap this up because there's lots more questions that have come in, but that's all we would have time for. Darlene?
Thanks very much. And thanks, Hargan, for the question. I think the idea here would be we would have to be deliberate. I think that already we are learning about being deliberate in the cadence or the rhythm of our interactions with people. And if we have deliberately sought to recruit talent from outside of our normal pool, perhaps outside of the city that we normally hire from, because we value the talent that we can bring in from elsewhere, and we're increasingly seeing this as a trend. I think we also have to deliberately make sure that face time is not the single biggest factor. In fact, it's perhaps maybe a small criteria among many other criteria that we would use to offer projects or promotions or what have you. But thanks for the question.
Okay, so that has been very rich, and I am now going to pass the baton to Emmy Froud. I'm sorry, I can't even talk anymore. Emmy Froud, who's going to wrap things up and say goodbye to everybody.
Thank you. I just wanted to say a quick note and thank all of our speakers for just participating today and also kind of providing some of your insight and expertise behind this topic. And also to our moderators, thank you for today. From all of us at IPAC, thank you for this afternoon to your evening and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.